There is a specific moment when the avoidant understands that something has changed. Not the gradual dawning awareness that you have been quieter lately, not the mild, manageable discomfort of your reduced availability that the avoidance pattern can absorb and explain and file under the familiar category of things that will return to normal eventually. Something more final than that. The moment they understand that you have not just stepped back, you have let go. And what follows that understanding is not what most people expect from an avoidant. Not the composed acceptance, not the self-sufficient shrug of someone who has always maintained that they do not need much, and is now simply living the proof of that claim. What follows is something the avoidant's entire architecture was built to prevent them from feeling. Panic. Not always visible, not always expressed in ways that the outside world would recognize as panic. The avoidance version of panic does not usually look like the anxious partner's version. It does not arrive as frantic messaging or dramatic declarations or the kind of emotional flooding that makes its own presence impossible to ignore. It arrives quietly, internally, in the specific escalating quality of a person who is realizing, in stages, that the story they were telling themselves about this situation is no longer holding. I want to walk through those 3 stages honestly, because I think understanding them changes something for the person who has finally, genuinely let go. Not as a reason to go back, not as a map for producing a particular response, but as the honest account of what is happening on the other side of the quiet that your letting go created. The first stage is disbelief. In the early period after the avoidant registers that something has shifted in you, their first response is not panic. It is the quiet but firm application of the most reliable tool in their psychological toolkit, reframing. The avoidant is extraordinarily good at reframing, at taking an incoming experience and reconstructing it in a way that makes it consistent with the story they are already telling, at interpreting the evidence in the light most favorable to their continued equilibrium. So the first stage sounds like this inside the avoidant. They are just taking space. They have done this before and come back. They are processing something. They are giving me the distance I seem to need. This is temporary. This is a phase. This is the same pattern we have been in before, just from the other direction this time. The reframing is not dishonest. It is not a deliberate attempt to avoid the truth. It is simply the automatic operation of a nervous system that has very strong reasons for not wanting the truth to be what it appears to be. Because if the truth is that you have genuinely let go, then the comfortable story about the dynamic, the one in which you are always there at some level regardless of what the avoidant does, is no longer available. And without that story, something the avoidant has been relying on, without knowing they were relying on it, disappears. The certainty of your presence as a background constant, the unconscious knowledge that however much distance was created, and however long the silence extended, and however little was offered in the space between the warmth and the withdrawal, you would be there. The reframing is an attempt to hold on to that certainty a little longer. But the reframing requires evidence to sustain it. And as your absence continues, as the quality of your letting go becomes more apparent in the specific, undeniable ways that genuine release is different from strategic withdrawal, the evidence stops cooperating. You are not reaching out in the ways you used to reach out. Not because you are managing the impulse strategically, because the impulse is genuinely quieter than it was. The energy that used to go towards maintaining the connection has been redirected. The monitoring has stopped. The subtle orientation of your attention towards the avoidant, which they could feel even when it was invisible, has moved. And the reframing starts to develop cracks, because the evidence it needs to remain stable is no longer being provided. This is when the first stage begins to dissolve, and the second stage arrives. The second stage is the inventory. This stage is internal and largely invisible from the outside, but it is one of the most significant psychological events in the avoidance experience of losing someone who genuinely let go. The inventory is what happens when the reframing fails, and the avoidant is forced to look, without the protective narrative, at what they actually had and what they actually did with it. It begins with the small things. The avoidant starts going through the history of the relationship, not in a linear or organized way, but in the involuntary, unbidden way that the mind reviews things when it is trying to make sense of something that does not make sense. They remember the specific moments, the ones where you reached and they managed the reaching, the ones where you were vulnerable and they responded with something functional rather than something present, the ones where the conversation was going somewhere real and they found a way, barely perceptible, to redirect it somewhere more comfortable. None of those individual moments seemed significant at the time. Each one could be explained. Each one felt, in the moment, like a reasonable navigation of the discomfort that intimacy produces in the avoidant. But in the inventory, seen together, the pattern of them is impossible to miss. And the pattern, seen clearly and without the in-the-moment justification for each individual instance, looks different from how it felt while it was happening. It looks like someone consistently, automatically, in ways both small and large, choosing the distance over the person. Not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but choosing it nonetheless. And you, in the inventory, look different too. Not the version of you that the avoidance pattern was responding to while you were there. Not the version filtered through the lens of what your presence required from them and how that requirement activated the withdrawal. The version that was actually there. The one who kept showing up, who kept reaching through the distance with a consistency that the avoidant can now see, in retrospect, was not something to be managed, but something to be honored. Who loved in a way that was real and patient and genuine, and that deserved something the avoidant kept almost but never quite giving. The inventory is painful in the specific way that clarity about your own pattern is painful. Not the sharp pain of a single wrong thing done, the slower, broader, more encompassing pain of seeing the full shape of what was done, accumulated over time in all its unintended but nevertheless real consequence. And in the inventory, the avoidant arrives at a question that the first stage's reframing was specifically designed to prevent. What did I do? Not what happened to us, not what went wrong between us, but what did I specifically, in the small choices and the automatic withdrawals and the managed distances and the consistent prioritization of my own comfort over the reality of what you were offering, what did I actually do? The answer to that question is not comfortable, and it is the threshold between the second stage and the third. The third stage is the one that the word panic most accurately describes, because it is the stage where the avoidant understands, with a clarity that the inventory produced and that the reframing can no longer soften, two things simultaneously: that what they had was genuinely rare, and that they may have made it impossible to recover. The panic of the third stage is not the panic of someone who has just discovered they want something. It is the panic of someone who has just discovered the full size of what they want, at the exact moment that its unavailability is becoming undeniable. The timing is the specific cruelty of it. Not cruel by design, but cruel in the way that certain truths are cruel. They arrive when they are ready to arrive and not before. And they are often not ready to arrive until the conditions that produce the delay, in this case the avoidance pattern and its automatic operation, have done enough damage that the loss is no longer theoretical. The third stage panic arrives in waves rather than all at once. The first wave is the impulse to reach out. Immediately and without the careful calibration that has always governed the avoidance behavior in this dynamic. The impulse is urgent in a way that the avoidance impulses almost never are. It does not feel like the managed decision to reestablish contact that the avoidance previous returns have been. It feels like the involuntary movement of someone who has just understood what they are losing and whose body is responding faster than their mind. But the second wave arrives almost simultaneously. The awareness that reaching out from this place, from the urgency of the third stage panic, is not reaching from growth. It is reaching from fear. And the difference between those two things is not only relevant to the other person's decision about whether to respond, it is relevant to the avoidant's own integrity, to whether the reaching is the beginning of something genuine or simply the latest expression of the pattern in a new form. Because the pattern can wear the costume of breakthrough. The avoidant knows this, even in the panic. The fear of loss can produce behavior that looks like growth from the outside. The urgency of the third stage can generate warmth and presence and availability that feel, in the moment, indistinguishable from the real thing. But if the reaching is motivated by the panic of loss, rather than the genuine shift that the loss was supposed to produce, then what happens next will follow the familiar arc. The reaching will restore enough security that the urgency subsides. The urgency subsiding will allow the pattern to reassert, and the reassertion of the pattern will confirm, for the person who is reached out to, that the reaching was not what it appeared to be. The third wave of the third stage is therefore the hardest. It is the avoidant sitting with the panic and the impulse and the awareness of what the impulse is coming from, and choosing, despite the discomfort of it, not to reach out until the reaching would be coming from somewhere real. Not everyone makes it to that third wave. Many avoidants, in the grip of the third stage panic, reach out from the urgency. Not because they are manipulative, because the panic is genuinely overwhelming, and the tool they have always used to manage overwhelming feelings is connection with the person who was the source of the feeling. And sometimes the person who let go receives that reaching, and something in them responds to it. Because the urgency feels like what they were always waiting for. The avoidant finally moving towards them, finally making the effort, finally choosing to close the distance rather than create it. And sometimes that reaching is followed by change. Real, sustained, genuine change that proves the urgency was the beginning of something rather than simply another expression of the pattern. But sometimes it is not followed by change. Sometimes the urgency produces just enough restoration of the connection that the panic subsides and the pattern resumes, and the person who let go finds themselves, weeks or months later, back inside the same dynamic that they genuinely, this time, believed they had left behind. So what do you do when the avoidant reaches out from the third stage? You do not have to decide immediately. The urgency is theirs. It does not have to become yours. You are allowed to receive the reaching with warmth and without an immediate answer, without the rush to restore the connection that the avoidance panic is generating, without the pressure of their urgency dictating the timeline of your response. You are allowed to wait, not as punishment, not as a strategy, but because the only information that tells you whether the reaching is coming from the panic or from genuine growth is what comes after the initial reaching. Whether the warmth sustains when the panic subsides, whether the presence continues when the urgency has settled, whether the avoidant, in the ordinary days and weeks after the initial contact, is behaving in a way that is different from what they were before you let go. Not perfectly different, not free of the pattern, but moving, visibly, consistently, unglamorously moving in the direction of the growth that the loss was asking for. That movement, sustained over time, is the only answer to the question that the third stage panic raised. Did this change anything? And you deserve to know the real answer to that question, not the answer that the urgency of the third stage produced. The answer that the ordinary, unurgent, completely honest days that come after it reveal. Because you did not let go to become available for another version of the same cycle. You let go because you had finally understood something the dynamic had been slowly teaching you. That you deserve to be chosen, not from panic, not from the fear of losing you, but from the quiet, daily, unglamorous, completely genuine decision of someone who has done enough work on themselves to know what choosing you actually requires, and who has decided, clearly and without the urgency of loss driving the decision, that you are worth every bit of it. Continuing from where we left, the decision that the avoidant arrives at, if they arrive at it genuinely, does not feel the way most people imagine it feels. Most people imagine that the moment an avoidant genuinely chooses someone, there is a clarity to it, a resolution, a sense of the fear finally being overcome by something stronger, a clean, decisive movement in one direction after years of oscillating between two. But that is not how it happens. The genuine choosing, when it comes, feels uncertain, uncomfortable, like stepping onto ground that has not been fully tested, rather than ground that has been confirmed as solid, like moving in a direction that the avoidance nervous system is still, even now, even after everything, generating resistance against. The difference between the genuine choosing and the panic-driven reaching is not in the feeling of certainty. It is in the willingness to move despite the uncertainty. The avoidant who reaches from panic is reaching to resolve a feeling, to reduce the discomfort of the third stage, to restore the equilibrium that your letting go disrupted. The movement is towards relief. And once the relief is obtained, the motivation for the movement diminishes. But the avoidant who is genuinely choosing is not moving towards relief. They are moving towards you, specifically, deliberately, with the full knowledge that the movement will not produce certainty or comfort or the resolution of the fear that has governed their relational life for as long as they can remember. They are moving towards you anyway. That distinction is everything. And it is visible in very specific ways that I want to describe, because I think the person who has let go deserves to know what genuine choosing actually looks like, so they can distinguish it from its imitation. The first visible sign of genuine choosing is that the avoidant stops disappearing when things become uncomfortable. Not that discomfort no longer arises, it does. The pattern does not evaporate because the decision to choose differently has been made. The withdrawal reflex still fires. The urge to create distance when closeness becomes real is still present, perhaps will always be present at some level, in someone whose nervous system was shaped by the experiences that produced the avoidant attachment in the first place. But the disappearing, the physical or emotional leaving of the conversation or the relationship, or the moment when it reaches a depth that activates the fear, stops being the automatic response. The avoidant stays, uncomfortably, imperfectly, sometimes visibly struggling with the staying in a way that is itself a form of honesty, but present. And presence, chosen against the grain of the pattern, is the most significant thing the avoidant can offer. Not the words, not the declarations, not the communication about how much they have been thinking, or how much they regret what the pattern cost, or how clearly they can now see what they could not see before. The staying. Because staying is where the pattern is actually interrupted, not in the thinking or the understanding or the articulation of the growth. In the moment where the withdrawal reflex fires and the avoidant feels it and does not act on it. That moment, small and unglamorous and invisible to anyone outside the relationship, is the genuine choosing made real. The second visible sign is that they bring things to you rather than waiting for you to draw them out. The avoidant who has genuinely moved towards choosing begins, slowly and imperfectly, and without the ease that will only come with sustained practice, to initiate the emotional depth rather than only tolerating it when you create it. They mention something from their interior life without being asked. They bring a difficulty they are navigating rather than managing it entirely privately. They share something that costs them something to share, not dramatically, not as a performance of vulnerability, but simply because something in them has decided that you are the person they want to bring this to. That initiation is significant because it represents the reversal of the most fundamental avoidant dynamic. The avoidant has always been the one who receives, who tolerates the intimacy that the other person creates, who responds, with varying degrees of presence, to the emotional depth that their partner brings to the space between them. But initiating is different. Initiating means choosing to enter the vulnerable territory rather than being brought there by someone else. It means the avoidant's own interior world, which has always been so carefully private and so thoroughly managed, beginning to have a direction, an outward direction, towards you. That shift, from receiving depth to initiating it, does not happen quickly. It does not happen without the discomfort that all genuine growth requires. But when it begins to happen, consistently and without being solicited, it is one of the clearest signs available that something real has changed. The third visible sign is that their consistency does not depend on yours. Inside the old dynamic, the avoidance, warmth, and presence were always, to some degree, calibrated to your behavior. When you pursued, they withdrew. When you withdrew, they warmed. The dynamic had a self-regulating quality that kept both people locked in their respective roles. But the avoidant who is genuinely choosing operates differently. Their consistency is not a response to what you do. It is not a function of how much you are pursuing, or how available you are being, or how much of your own warmth you are currently extending towards them. It is simply there. Not perfectly, not without variation, but as a baseline that does not shift dramatically based on your emotional temperature in any given week. This matters enormously, because the self-regulating quality of the old dynamic meant that your behavior was always, in some sense, the thing that governed theirs, which put you in the impossible position of having to modulate your own authenticity in service of the dynamic stability. The avoidant who is genuinely choosing removes that burden by being present in a way that does not require you to manage your own presence in order to produce theirs, by showing up with a consistency that is internally generated rather than externally triggered. That is what it feels like to be in a relationship with someone who is actually doing the work rather than performing the intention to do it. It feels, for perhaps the first time in this dynamic, like you can simply be yourself, without calculating the effect of being yourself on their availability, without managing your own emotional expression in service of their comfort, without the exhausting, constant background process of monitoring and adjusting and hoping and bracing that the old dynamic required. Just yourself. And that specific, extraordinary, almost disorienting experience of simply being yourself in the presence of this person, without the dynamic distorting it, is the relationship that the bond was always pointing towards. The one that the pattern was always preventing. The one that 3 stages of panic and genuine reckoning and the sustained, unglamorous work of choosing differently finally made possible. Now I want to say something to the person who let go. To the person whose letting go was the thing that set all of this in motion. The letting go was not nothing. It was not a strategy, even if it produced strategic effects. It was not a tactic, even if it triggered a response that looked like the desired outcome of a tactic. It was not a move in a dynamic that you had finally figured out how to play correctly. It was the honest expression of someone who had reached the end of what they were able to give in the current form of the relationship and had made the genuine, difficult, entirely real decision to redirect their life towards themselves. And that decision, however it was experienced from the outside, was the most important thing that happened in this dynamic. Not because of what it produced in the avoidant, because of what it produced in you. The return to yourself. The reclamation of the interior life that the dynamic had been quietly occupying. The slow, imperfect, genuinely yours process of rebuilding a relationship with your own becoming that does not have the avoidant at its center. That process is not a consolation prize for not having the relationship you wanted. It is the thing the relationship was always asking you to develop. Because the version of you that exists at the end of genuine letting go, the version that has done the difficult internal work of releasing a specific outcome and redirecting towards your own life, is not the same version of you that entered the dynamic. You are more self-possessed, more honest about what you need, and less willing to negotiate it downward to fit someone else's limitations. More aware of the difference between love and self-abandonment, more capable of the specific, grounded, unperformed presence that is the only kind of presence worth offering to anyone. And if the avoidant arrives at the genuine choosing, if the 3 stages of panic produce genuine reckoning, rather than simply a more urgent version of the old pattern, then both of you arrive at each other changed, not fixed, not free of the patterns that were built in you long before you found each other, but changed in the specific direction that makes something real possible. 2 people who have both, in different ways and through different processes and at different speeds, done enough of their own work to show up for something that neither of them could have held at the beginning. That is not a guaranteed outcome. I will not pretend that every avoidant who passes through 3 stages of panic arrives at genuine growth. Some do not. Some cycle back. Some reach out from urgency, restore the connection, and find that the pattern reasserts faster than the growth could establish itself. And some people who let go discover, in the process of letting go, that what they actually needed was to be free of the dynamic entirely. Not to receive the avoidance eventual growth, but to no longer be in proximity to the cost of waiting for it. Both of those are valid. Both of those are honest. What is not valid is returning before you have seen the evidence, before the consistency has been demonstrated over enough time to be distinguishable from urgency, before the staying has been practiced in enough uncomfortable moments to be something other than a pattern temporarily disrupted by panic. You deserve the evidence, not the promise, not the urgency, not the reaching that comes from the 3rd stage and that carries in its intensity the implicit message that this time is different. Show me different, in the ordinary days, in the small moments, in the staying when the staying is hard and the withdrawal reflex is loud, and the distance that always felt like safety is right there, available, as it has always been available. Show me the choosing, quietly, consistently, without the panic driving it. That is the only thing worth coming back for. And you, having let go with the honesty and the difficulty and the genuine cost that real letting go requires, you know that now, in a way you did not know it before. And that knowing is yours, regardless of what comes next, regardless of what the avoidant does with the 3 stages, regardless of whether the forever bond produces a future or simply remains what it has been. The truth of what you are worth, arrived at through the hardest way available, and completely, permanently, irrevocably yours.